My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. I am sitting here with Samantha Dillon, who today is joining us from Texas, but she has some deep roots in other parts of the country as well, not too far from where I'm sitting. And Samantha loves indigo snakes, among many things. And the thing that kind of prompted this was that she's out in Texas working on Texas Indigo Snakes. And while I've been working with Eastern Indigo Snakes for many, many years and research and land conservation and conservation planning, just so many aspects of their recovery in the Southeast, I have had very little experience with Texas Indigos. I finally last year was able to make my first trip to Texas and see my first Texas Indigo in the wild. And Sam and I were recently at a conference and had the opportunity to talk a little bit about indigo snakes. And I thought it would be a great idea to get her on here to talk about Texas Indigos. And she's currently a graduate student in Texas, and to talk a little bit about her work there. So I'm excited for this one. So welcome to the podcast, Sam. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you.
Yeah. So as you may know, if you've heard any episodes, I like to get to know our guests a little bit more before we get into kind of the meat of the episode. And so I know that you just love snakes and herpetology in general. And so I want to start and try to figure out where did that come from? Did you, is this something that kind of happened when you were a young child? Is it something that hit you a little bit later in life? How did this love of indigo snakes and everything else herpetology come to you?
So I'm from South Florida, and my parents, that's where they met, was in South Florida. And they loved to, before herping was a term, they would go out to the cane fields, drive around the Everglades, big cypress. They just loved herps. And, snorkeling, all the other South Florida things. So both my parents, while not, scientists themselves, really kind of fostered and really, ignited the passion for herps. And so I grew up in South Florida. My dad and I would go he told me that you could find yellow rat snakes in hollow cypress trees. So every time we drove past a stand of cypress trees, I'm like, let's go find a rat snake. So just growing up with parents that really kind of fed that passion. And then the indigos were always, both of them, just revered indigos. And for me as a kid, I'm like, man, this must be a really cool snake. South Florida, it's had a history of, a lot of anthropogenic disturbance. And there were a lot of indigos at one point in time, but it's not exactly something you came by. But yeah, just to add on to childhood Sam, when I was in second grade, we had to do an endangered species project. And while everyone was picking tigers and crocodiles, I picked the Eastern Indigo snake. So I was the odd one out in that group, but yeah.
That's great. That's kind of a unique story. Everybody tells me their story, and a lot of people who are on the podcast, we'll have the story of they were really into it as a child. Some people have, the story that it kind of came to them a little bit later in life through various vectors. But even the people who, were really just it's almost like it was in their genes. Most of them didn't have parents who also were into the same types of things and fostered that. So that's a pretty unique trajectory. It's interesting to hear. And I don't know where your parents live or what health they're in or what, but they must be pretty proud of you if they're still around, and
Yeah.
must be excited to get out with you when they can. So,
Yeah.
but so you're just immersed in this. I mean, you're spending your childhood pulling over to look in, hollowed out cypress trees for rat snakes, and so you're coming up as a young child, and so you've already got this passion instilled in you for these animals. And then, but you said your parents didn't do this like professionally. It was more of a hobby or an interest or a form of recreation. So what point in your life and what were some of, like, what made you realize that, oh, wait, this is something I could actually do for a career?
So I just, context, I am a first generation student in my family. I am, as far as I know, the first one to even pursue higher education from like a big university. I kind of have an atypical, entry into my academic career. I, was not great at school in high school and stuff. Comes out later, I was undiagnosed ADHD. I was unmedicated. Kind of happens a lot with women. We fly under the radar, but I didn't have good grades. And so I went and I worked a retail job after high school. And that was enough for me to be like, I can't do this. Like, I have to do something. I need to go to school. And, being first generation and, not coming from, I guess, like financial means, I was concerned about the cost of school. And I was just low bar. I'm like, I'll just be a zookeeper. Like, how can I work with snakes that I can get done really quick and easy? So I started at a state college a year after I graduated high school, just general biology. And thankfully, there are a lot of, grants in place for not just first generation, but, my parents are divorced. So there's a little bit of that with income. So grants really helped fund the first half of my education. But the zookeeper thing changed, though. My second year into undergrad, my biology 2 professor, he's an entomologist. And first day of class, he told us, if I'm off in the corner looking at something, I'm probably looking at a bug. I'm an entomologist. And he had an entomology degree. And after class, I went up to him like, I want to get a herpetology degree. Like, where can I do that? Because when you look online, it's like places in Australia or, the US doesn't really have like herpetology degrees. And he's like, well, that's kind of difficult. He's more or less said the same thing that I had found online. But at the end of the semester, he emailed me. He remembered that and emailed me an internship posting at Archibald Biological Station with gopher tortoises. And, my resume was 1 page. My only experience was having pet snakes, and recreationally looking for snakes. But if you don't know where Archibald is, on the Lake Wales Ridge in South Central Florida, really cool place, highest area of endemicity in the state. But they have a very long-term monitoring project of gopher tortoises there. So that internship, there was just a day in the field where it hit me. I'm like, this is it. I don't want to be a zookeeper anymore. This is what I want to do.
Were you?
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you were working with Betsy there. Is that right?
I was working with Betsy, and that is actually where I first got introduced to the Orient Society. There was a technician, Patrick Barnhart, there had been indigos that had radio transmitters, surgically implanted. So he was capturing them to have the transmitters removed. So he actually showed me, he'd bring them back to the lab. I got to see my first Cooperi in person. His name was Sigma. Very big, awesome snake. In fact, actually, someone brought in an indigo they found on their property. And whenever they pit tag them, you get to name it. And there's one named Sam running around on our school, hopefully somewhere.
Yeah, that I just had coffee with Betsy 2 days ago, I guess it was. But anyways.
Betsy's awesome.
Yeah, they spent some time up here in the mountains as well. So they were up here and we met. But yeah, and that project. So you were there at the tail end of our South Florida, Central Florida, whatever you might want to call it, Indigo project, where I had a postdoc who was studying, a PhD that then turned into a postdoc who was studying indigo snakes. And that's great. Small world. So anyway, so you're doing this internship. So you're still an undergrad at this small college, but you want to kind of focus on herpetology, and you end up getting this herpetology-focused internship, and you kind of have this moment in the field with gopher tortoises and realize this is what you want to do. So are you done with your undergrad degree at this point, or are you still working on it?
This was early on. So I did I got my associates and then I transferred to the University of Central Florida in 2014. So the internship was 2013. I had applied to just UF and UCF, and due to not knowing stuff about prerequisites, I didn't get into UF, which is fine. But UCF was close to home, about an hour from Sebring, which is where I was living and going to school at the time. So in 2014 was when I transferred up there, but internship was early on. However, Betsy was great because she was able to connect me with someone from the Central Florida Zoo, because she knew I wanted to work with indigos, and that opened the door to my next internship, which was at the Oregon Center for Indigo Conservation. And I interned there for 6 months, volunteered for another 6 months because I didn't want to leave. And that was right after Central Florida Zoo had started to, kind of take over the maintenance and the program there. I worked there when Fred Antonio was the director, but yeah, that was 2014, 2015. I finally got to work with indigos, and that really solidified that I did not want to be a zookeeper, because, man, if you have ever had to clean up after 60 indigos, you know how quick they poop.
Yeah, it's hard taking care of just a couple of them, trust me.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So there's lots of Orianne Society, like, kind of weaves in and out of your history in different ways. So I love that. But yeah, the Central, or the Orianne Center for Indigo Conservation, we've done episodes on that facility, but that's where a lot of the captive breeding happens for the reintroduction program. So it's basically a large, like, state-of-the-art husbandry facility where we do breeding and research around, kind of how to effectively breed these snakes and produce young, and in preparation for reintroduction. So that's great, and I'm glad you were able to be there. So you do that position, and then it sounds like you even stayed on longer volunteering. And then where did you were you done at Central Florida then, or was that during your degree?
No, so my undergrad was a 6-year affair. I was working full time in addition to interning and taking classes. So I did have some difficulties with, there's something called transfer shock. And if anyone who went to UCF knows, they like to boast that they're the largest university, second largest in the country, 66,000 students. And I think that number has increased since then. So I came from a small state college where I had maybe 30 people max in the class to, a 7 a.m. stats lecture with 175 people. So I did suffer a little bit of what they call transfer shock and had to retake some classes. And, it was I had to take shorter semesters for, just to fit in internships, because at that point I'm like, well, I think graduating with, at least something on a resume and, gaining the field experience for a job I want, was something that didn't take precedence over finishing faster. It's just, that's the thing that's happening with STEM undergraduate degrees. It's not always necessarily the cookie cutter for anymore, unless you can work on classwork full time, which I was not able to, again, because I had to support myself. I was self-sustaining. I didn't have, my parents lived far away. And, it's like anytime I moved, I had to pay my own rent, take everything with me. So it was just, I was living as an adult while doing a degree. So it took me a little bit longer. 2017 is when I graduated. But after the Indigo Center, I did volunteer with some drift fencing and surveying around ponds in Ocala, with a student or a technician from University of Florida. And that's kind of where I fell in love with pine forests, the longleaf pine especially. Ocala, that became, I would take Sundays off from work and I would just go to Ocala or go to other parts of Central Florida and just be outside, look for snakes, look for herps, just enjoy being outside and not in a restaurant.
Well, that's great. Well, I have, I don't think having to take classes over is not that big a deal. I had to do that many times as well. I don't know if mine was from transfer shock. It was probably more like from hangover shock or something. But yes, yeah. I was not the best student either. So, but then you get the
theme I'm noticing with field ecologists. It's like I felt so. The imposter syndrome is always there. And again, I was forging my own path. And I was not interacting, most of the people I was interacting with at UCF, they were higher level, like systematics labs, disease ecology, people that did really well in school were in those labs. So I was not getting a lot of people around me that wanted to do what I did or had succeeded at doing what I wanted to do who also experienced that. So I found that in my career field, like, man, I wish I could go back and tell my undergrad self, like, it's going to be fine.
Yep. Yeah. And similarly, I came from modest means and worked throughout college and racked up major loan bills and all of this stuff. So anyways, but so I think one thing that tells about a person and also instills in them as they move forward, someone like yourself, is that you really want it. You had to work much harder maybe than some other people in some ways to actually achieve, where you're on your way to. So I think while it can be harder in ways, I think it can also make you stronger in other ways that will, inevitably, help in your career going forward. So yeah, really glad to hear your story. So you're at University of Central Florida. You're finishing there. You do the 6-year plan. I think I had the 5-year plan, if I remember right, from undergrad. Anyways, and then you're sitting in Texas, as I talked about now. So talk about that. How did you get from Central Florida and spending your Sundays in the Ocala to where you're sitting today?
So I was working in a venom phylogenetic lab, and I intended to stay on with them after I graduated, but then the PI got a position at Clemson, so they moved. And at the time, I have family in Virginia, and, this was in 2017, so there were some issues going on with, job funding and availability in Florida. I ended up moving to coastal Virginia and lived with a couple of friends. It was really hard to get a job in a state where I hadn't really made the connections, but I did end up getting an AmeriCorps position, which, is technically not a job, it's like a volunteer with a living stipend, but I did natural resource work in, one of the districts of Virginia, and they were all the coastal counties. But that's where I got my intro. That's where I got my fire training. It's where I got to, I first started doing chainsaw and habitat work. But the beauty of AmeriCorps, because they know that they use the line dirty deeds done dirt cheap, it's cheap labor, but it was really nice because there's like a freedom within that framework. I got to, I set up just doing frog call surveys at our main park, barking tree frogs. Fun fact for anyone who hasn't been to Virginia, everything we have in numbers in the Southeast is protected in Virginia or rare because it's the northern extent of their range. So I would do frog call surveys. We had set out, artificial cover at our parks in our districts. So whenever we were done doing invasive treatment, any prescribed burning, cutting, doing pollinator fields, I got to do stuff I really enjoyed. And my supervisor, made sure that we all were doing something that we were getting something out of and not just the dirty work, and that getting the fire qualls, that's when I ran in, my first ever prescribed fire in 2018. I met my now lifelong mentor. His name's Bobby Klontz. He works for the Nature Conservancy in Virginia. And he saw the passion that I had. And, at the time, I was a little untethered because the herp jobs were not, they're not easy to come by in Virginia. I did end up being a technician for a master's student through VCU in between AmeriCorps and TNC. It kind of overlapped, but I did radio telemetry of spotted turtles in the forest that I ended up working at with TNC. So that was a lot of fun. But when I got with TNC, my main role as the intern there was fire restoration for red cockaded woodpeckers. And, I feel like herp people have beef with birds. And here's the thing about birds. Birding's fun if you already know how to herp. You already have the habitat associations down, and it really kind of softens the blow of not finding a snake. So, but my boss was the one that kind of made me. It was Earth Day, and he knew I was a little snake kid who just wanted to peel bark and look for stuff. And he put binoculars in my hand. He's like, "You're going to learn how to bird today." So, and I was working with woodpeckers, so it was a skill I needed, but I did 2 years with the Nature Conservancy as a fire intern, got a lot of really good fire experience and just built up a lot of relationships there. But I was homesick. I was ready to get back to, I missed saw palmettos, if I'm being honest, but I was ready to get back south. And that's when I applied for my position with the Longleaf Alliance, where I got to do habitat restoration and monitoring of reticulated flatwood salamanders. And I stayed there for 4 years. And from there is how I ended up in Texas. And if you want to ask anything, we can move on from that point. Yeah.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a quick break and tell you that the Orianne Society is dedicated to protecting some of North America's most at-risk species and their habitats, like Eastern Indigo Snakes in the longleaf savannas, Eastern Hellbenders in the Appalachian Highlands, and wood turtles in the Great Northern Forests. Healthy ecosystems depend on these incredible animals, but these landscapes and species need our help to survive. If you care about reptiles, amphibians, and the wild places they call home, visit www.orianne.org to learn more about our work and how you can get involved. Yeah, I mean, so you're at Texas A&M, correct? And
yes.
So how was there a position open that you applied for, or did you start reaching out to faculty there? Did you know you wanted to go that way because you wanted to work on Texas Indigos? Was it, again, just somebody you knew? Like, how did you, what's that final step in terms of, where you're sitting today?
It was kind of cosmic, because I had been a wildlife technician with the Longleaf Alliance for, 3 years. At a certain point, there were a lot of growth opportunities, but I did feel like I was hitting a ceiling in terms of, I'm not getting the analysis skills and research skills to kind of secure a long-term position. Working for nonprofits is great until it's like you run into limitations because of funding. So I'd already been thinking about, I'm going to start looking for, grad positions. I was looking much further west. And then, I checked the Texas A&M job board. And when I saw the posting, so I work for the Natural Resources Institute, which is Texas A&M's kind of like a applied, field science branch, if you will, a little bit of contracting going on. But it was a job posting for a research assistant while I would also be getting my master's. And it had all, Texas Indigo Snakes, Texas Tortoises, Texas Horned Lizards. It's in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, and it was studying how anthropogenic disturbance was, impacting these. And it was a Fish and Wildlife Service funded project. So it just was so cosmic because it's like I've already worked with gopher tortoises, Eastern Indigos. I did a little bit of mole skink work in undergrad. I just love Texas Horned Lizards, Rhinosoma in general. So it was just perfect. And I remember feeling something shift. I'm like, even if I'm not ready to, because they wanted me to start in January. I applied late 2023. And even if they wanted me to move super fast, I could figure it out because there was no way that I could let this opportunity pass me by to not only take the next step in my career, but also get to work with animals that I'm very excited about in general. Even at the time, I'd never seen a Texas tortoise, but I had spent some time in the Rio Grande Valley on trips with friends where we went birding and looking for indigo snakes and speckled racers. And I just love it. It's a very unique part of Texas, but it also is very reminiscent of where I grew up in South Florida, like these ag fields, really hot and humid, right on the edge of the Everglades. It's kind of like that on the edge of the Rio Grande down there. So
that's what I thought. Like, I was amazed because I've been all over Texas. I just had never been down there. And when I went there last year, I was like, this is different. This feels really different. And it reminded me, different, but it did remind me of South Florida, where I've also spent a fair amount of time. So.
Oh, yeah. So, I got that. And that's now almost a year into this position. I moved to Texas last April. So,
great.
And been thriving ever since.
Well, let's talk, let's transition a little bit and talk about Texas Indigo Snakes. And we may touch on tortoises and some other things. But let's start off, for people who don't know much about them, just talking about some general things with them. So first of all, like, where, what's their distribution? And I'm not, I don't want to give away the names of any places and
Yeah, oh,
hotspot,
yeah.
but like where do you find Texas Indigos in the US and beyond?
So their current distribution, or at least their historical distribution, has been, from north. Okay, so they're a subspecies of Central American indigos. You know how taxonomy can be; it's pretty contested. So where Arabinus ends and Melanurus begins is kind of foggy for me because I haven't been to that side of the border yet. But at least in Texas, there is a geologic formation just south of San Antonio called the Balcones Escarpment. It runs west into, the armpit of Texas, for a lack of a better term. And then there's the San Antonio River that runs from San Antonio out to the Gulf. And that bottom horn of South Texas, it is pretty much what their historical distribution was I guess established as. But we are seeing a little bit of their range spreading beyond north into beyond San Antonio. And there's, if you don't know, the Texas Hill Country is on limestone. So I think that them having adequate moisture and being able to get away from freezing temperatures might have something to do with that. But for the most part, the bottom South Texas plains all the way to the Rio Grande would be their United States distribution.
And how does their range overlap with the Texas tortoise?
Texas tortoises are similarly restricted by the Balcones Escarpment and the San Antonio River, but indigos are highly mobile. They have, I think, all dry mark on at this point, but the tortoises are similarly restricted, but I think their range just extends into northeast Mexico and Tamaulipas. I'd have to double check that, but it's pretty well matched up.
And is there a strong relationship? I mean, obviously Texas tortoises are different than gopher tortoises, but in many parts of the range, not necessarily, where you were in South Florida, but in many parts of the range, there's a real tight relationship between gopher tortoises and indigo snakes. Do you see any relationships between them, whether it be, something about habitat? Eastern indigo snakes are predators of baby gopher tortoises. Is there anything like that we know about? But anyway, do we see a similar tortoise indigo snake relationship to what we do in the Southeast?
So that's been kind of funny and an adjustment for me. I really like having that Southeastern context because it really is. It's so there's some similarities, but there's so much different here. So Texas tortoises do not build established burrows. They're kind of a pathetic, example of a gopherus. They dig just these little shallow, like pallets, or what they're referred to in the literature, but it's just enough that they are covered. Or they'll use like armadillo burrows, stuff like that. The Texas tortoises don't build established burrows, and what I've read, they don't really have site fidelity. Like they're not going out from and to somewhere the way gopher tortoises do. Mm-hmm. And my lab mate, Dr. Cameron Keel, now she just defended her thesis, actually doing telemetry with Texas tortoises. It's the inverse of gopher tortoises. They tend to avoid open herbaceous stuff, and they actually use the thorn scrub moths to thermoregulate, brumate, to escape fire, because that was the focus of her study. So there is not, nothing empirically has been studied. There is scant literature on Texas indigo snakes. It is equally as frustrating as it is exciting, because, when I was doing my literature review, when I started, I was digging. I got my SSAR membership just so I could get access to all the herp notes, without having to buy a bunch of journals. And it's funny you talk about, Eastern indigos eating baby gopher tortoises. One of the natural history notes I found was they were surveying across the border, just across from the Texas border, and they picked up a Texas indigo and it regurgitated 3 baby Texas tortoises.
Wow.
So that cool. Still happens. But yeah, there is not, as far as I know, with the tortoises and indigos here, there is not a very tight relationship. It Gotcha. Just seems they both do well in these similar environmental conditions down here.
Gotcha. So with the Texas indigos, in terms of their movements, and I know, as you said, we actually know very little. So most of this may be things we're learning now or need to learn in the future. But Eastern Indigo snakes are known to have one of the largest home ranges of any native snake in North America. And so what do we know, or do we know anything, whether that be like empirical published data or anecdotal, but do we know anything about Texas indigo movements, and are they similar or different to Easterns?
So my Bible, the only thing I have of Texas Indigo Snakes is a textbook by John Werler and James Dixon. It's a Texas snake. It's from 2000. And they have a pretty thorough, section on Texas Indigos. They are still considered, well, they're the largest snake in Texas, only really rivaled by bull snakes. But they are still, at least they say they are still have the largest home range of any snake in Texas that they knew of at the time 25 years ago. But nothing recent, or no telemetry studies have been done. There's nothing empirically, discovered yet about their movements. In my literature review, I'm referring to all Cooper Eye literature for, home range and movement estimates. I'm just assuming, Drymarchon, they all kind of have similar, habits within the genus, but I'm running on a lot of assumptions because this hasn't been looked at closely yet.
Yeah. Well, we already talked about the relationship, or maybe a lack of as direct a connection to the tortoise down there in Texas. But as you know, again, in much of the range of Eastern Indigo snakes, again, not where you're from, but in much of the range, that tight relationship results in kind of a general pattern where indigo snakes spend cooler months in higher, drier habitats, oftentimes associated with tortoise burrows or other type of stump holes and other types of deep holes in the soil to kind of escape cool temperatures. But then they leave those areas for the most part, and they spend the bulk of their time in kind of lower, wetter, cooler, more seasonally diverse, if you will, with food places. So they kind of have this seasonal habitat use between lower, wetter, higher, drier. And I'm just curious, again, we may not know, because it sounds like we do not know a lot at this point, but do we know if Texas indigos have anything similar? Are they, habitat-wise, are they in drier habitats? Are they in wetter habitats? Are they using them both? Is that seasonal, or is that just something we have no idea of?
So this is something I'm actually excited to talk about. So for my thesis, I am putting together, species distribution models, also known as habitat suitability models. So I have to spend a lot of time thinking like an indigo and trying to figure out what is suitable, like what are they selecting for. Drymarchon in general, or Eastern indigos, I don't know what happened in the evolutionary history, but Drymarchon are subtropical snakes. They're prone to desiccation. So that tide of moisture, they just, in the textbook by Werler and Dixon, it just talks about how intimately associated they are with moisture on the landscape. And, with Eastern indigos, we know, they're in much more temperate areas, maybe not so much in South Florida, but in South Florida, they're using limestone holes. In the absence of gopher tortoises, they are using other subterranean refuge. And part of that, when it's the heat of the day, staying in cooler, wetter areas is to, reduce water loss and obviously heat stress. But you can see, it's really been nice to kind of dive into this and relate everything I know about Eastern indigos, because even in the wintertime, yes, they're using tortoise burrows to get below where there are freezing temperatures. But also think about the moisture that is deeper in those burrows too. So we know that winters tend to be drier in the sandhills, depending on where you are in the range. The panhandle is a little bit different, but they still have that need for moisture, and they're getting that from the gopher tortoise burrows. So with Texas indigos, and again, nothing is empirically proven, but in my study area, the lower Rio Grande Valley, they are, one, they're the most common snake, I gotta say, but this region, it represents the transition from temperate to subtropical. And it is considered subtropical and semi-arid, but it's pretty wet down there most of the time, especially along the Rio Grande. There used to be a lot of palm groves, but there's still a lot of, we've got resacas, which are basically just oxbow lakes. There are these, isolated ephemeral wetlands up where it's drier called remederos. We've got arroyos, which are basically just little wet stringers, kind of like creek fingers, out where it's more arid. So, at least in the lower Rio Grande Valley, they're pretty ubiquitous, because there's plenty of moisture available on the landscape. However, and this is just, kind of a personal communication between me and one of my bosses, it's Toby Hibbets. He's a Texas naturalist, native Texan. He's been looking for these things his whole life. He thinks that they do have more of a seasonal, movement as you move further up in the range. I can find them no problem in December. My first snake of the year on January 3rd was a Texas Indigo snake in the Rio Grande Valley. But when you get up closer to San Antonio, you're getting more of that temperature, that temperate, the hard freezes. So I suspect that's when they're retreating into, limestone, holes, caves, etc., and just their movement picks up whenever it's not freezing anymore. But again, nothing empirically proven, just kind of something that I've talked about with Toby and just a suspicion.
Yeah, interesting. Well, maybe you'll learn more. And how about diet? Indigo snakes, Eastern Indigo snakes are relatively famous for their diet, and we've done studies over the years that it basically showed that about 50% of their diet are other snakes. In general, they're kind of generalists in a sense. I mean, they are kind of gape restricted, meaning they're not eating things that are that much larger than them, because of just the structure of the head and the bones and the muscles that they've evolved. So they eat a lot of snakes, and they're known for that. They'll eat other things as well. How about Texas Indigos? What do we know about their diet?
Well, when I moved here, I not even related to, I was on Facebook, and it wasn't even related to like one of the herp groups I was in, but there's a landowner that's like, remember, if it's an indigo, let it go. That is a common saying. Texas is a huge private land state, a lot of ranchers. Nobody likes atrox. Nobody likes rattlesnakes. So they, ranchers were catching them and releasing them onto their property to eat because, obviously we know people think indigos only eat snakes. It's not the only thing they eat. They are pretty generalistic down here too. One of my records I used to build my model with excellent is an indigo up in a mesquite tree pulling a rat snake out to eat it, which I know it's another snake, but I at least have the Texas tortoise regurgitation, and it's very similar. Generalist, but yes, they are huge fans of atrox, are their favorite food here apparently. And in talking to some of the people that work in my study area, because I work across I survey across 3 counties on the southern tip of Texas. And as you get closer to the coast, it's very dense with indigos. I have yet to see a live Western diamondback. And I was told when I moved here and was working to this study area, you're tripping over atrox. I have yet to see a single live one. But I talked to one of the Border Patrol agents, and he's like, yeah, from here to the coast, you never see rattlesnakes, but you always see the indigos. But as I move west into my more arid counties, my technician has seen rattlesnakes. I have yet to, but I definitely see a drop off in how many indigos I am seeing. So whether the density or the abundance of atrox is linked to the density or the abundance of indigos has yet to be determined. But it is, yes, they do eat a lot of snakes, and they are famous for it here. They're revered by landowners, actually.
Okay. Interesting. How about, I'm trying to think what else about their just kind of a general ecology. How about like reproduction? Indigo snakes in the southeast are a little bit different in that than many snakes, not all, but many, in that, their breeding season is kind of a winter breeding season when they're in these gopher tortoise, upland, xeric, dry type habitats. We know relatively little about where they lay their eggs in the wild. There's actually last year we made a big jump in our knowledge in terms of finding multiple nests. But before that, there was something like 2 or 3 ever found. But the point is, we're still fewer than 10 documented Eastern Indigo nests ever found. But with Texas Indigos, what do we know about reproduction? Anything from seasonality to where the females might lay the eggs, anything like that. But anything interesting about reproduction you can share with us?
Yeah, so it's very similar to Eastern Indigos. I actually was, I try not to use social media constantly anymore, but I was keeping tabs on Facebook because almost every single day people were posting in like Texas snake groups, they were getting indigos combating in their backyard. And this is from, as early as late October. And then I just reactivated my Facebook, so I don't know how things were from January till now. But I mean, I was reaching out to people. I'm like, hey, if you're comfortable, can you send me the pin of that? Because this textbook, almost all the information they have on reproduction is from captive, or captive specimens, or from like catching a gravid indigo. So again, winter breeders, very similar. They do the combating. I've been just it has nothing to do with my thesis, but I've still been trying to just build a repository of confirmable, pinning it to a time, a place. One of the best videos was 2 indigos combating over a female, and she was just markedly smaller than the 2 males, but right in somebody's backyard in South Texas. But as for where they lay eggs, again, I mean, more than we do, that's for sure. But I can only assume, there are, a lot of armadillo burrows. They spend a lot of times in like pack rat mounds. Anywhere that the moisture can probably be sustained is what I would assume. I know at the Indigo Center, when we had females that were gravid in the outdoor enclosures, we tried to offer them multiple sites to kind of see what they would choose. And of course, they always picked the corrugated pipe of their fake gopher tortoise burrow and make us dig it out of the ground to get them out. But we did have some lay in like leafy stump holes that we kind of made for them. And yeah, so I can only imagine wherever moisture is adequate. And honestly, the valley, one of the unique things about it, in the wintertime, they don't get a lot of hard freezes, but it does fog a lot. The humidity is really high throughout the winter down there. Which is something that has been beneficial, I think, for the tortoise and the indigo. There's a lot of available water, so I'm wondering if that would change where they would lay their eggs. But yeah, I aimed my field trip this time to try to maybe catch the tail end of gravid females moving. Worth mentioning, a year of surveying, I've gotten a single female Texas Indigo snake. It has been all males. And I know from the Eastern Indigo literature, the males do maintain larger home ranges, but it is kind of insane that literally one female is the only. Yeah, it's been all males. So I'm trying to hopefully get some gravid females when I go down in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Oh. Well, that's a good transition right there. 'Cause let's kind of leave just general Texas Indigo ecology. Actually, one more question for you on that, and then I want to talk about your thesis more. So. And a number of people do this in the Southeast. People who are interested in herps end up doing in the fire business, if you will. Prescribed fire is huge in the Southeast. And it sounds like you almost ended up in the fire business full time. Like, it sounds like that's the break you made when you went to grad school, because if not, you probably would have ended up, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's an incredible career track. But so talk about natural disturbance. Obviously there'd be drought in that region, but talk about, and I'm assuming it's a monsoon type climate. Maybe I'm wrong there. I know West Texas is, but anyways,
West Texas,
mainly,
yeah.
Maybe talk about fire. Is fire an important part of that ecosystem and the ecology of things like Texas Indigos and Texas Tortoises?
Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a break and tell you guys that snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. The Orianne Society works every day to ensure there's a future for these amazing animals. If you care about snakes, wildlife, or wild places, and you like what you've been hearing on the Snake Talk podcast, support us today by donating on our website at www.orianne.org.
So that was, I didn't really talk about it much, but my time at the Alliance, my time was split pretty 50-50 with habitat management, not just restoration, but with fire also. So I have been building both my herpetology kind of side of my career and my fire in tandem, because there is a growing need for practitioners and scientists both. Frequently they butt heads over management and stuff without realizing there's common goals. And, when I was initially looking at grad school before I saw this position, I really wanted to do a herp fire related project. But so in South Texas, so the Southeast obviously is leading the country in, prescribed fire, just figuring out, they're building the wheel, right? And the Southwest obviously gets devastated by wildfires, but they are starting to, they send, firefighters to the Southeast to learn, and they're starting to bump the needle in the right direction. But Texas being a largely private land state and also being in the middle of that convergence, it's a little bit, there are some detrimental wildfires that have occurred in Texas, but they're a little bit behind on some of the science of it. For me, when I see, you think about the plains, it's a grassland. And when I see a grassland, I know there's a relationship to fire there, because grasses are storing most of their carbon underground. It's evolved for that kind of thing. And, South Texas is no different. It is a subtropical, semi-arid grassland. It's mixed. I don't think the riparian, it's just like anywhere else, right? Different ecosystems have different fire return intervals. But when I met with the fire manager down at Santa Ana, so he covers the whole South Texas research, or the South Texas Refuge Complex, I asked him, like, what's the fire return interval for these ecosystems? He's like, we don't know. I found a really old document that tried to say it was every 60 years, but that is not the case. There are woody encroachment problems that is not just impacting, natural ecosystems, but that also messes with, cattle ranchers and stuff. Woody encroachment is a known issue. And mesquite, it's a native, but it is an opportunistically invasive native, kind of like tie and flatwood salamander wetlands. If left unchecked, it's just going to take over, and that's kind of an issue. So there is not a hard and fast, empirical relationship established yet, but the fire manager in South Texas, he really wants to expand out and learn more. And, I might try to help with some post-burn monitoring with them, just to kind of get them some data, so that they can kind of figure things out a little bit more. But there are the East Foundation, I just said my lab mate just defended, they do a lot of prescribed burning for research. And she was, she did it with Texas tortoises, looking at growing season, dormant season, all that. So, there's Texas A&M, my department, Rangeland Fisheries and Wildlife Management, RW. No, I did it backwards. Anyways, there are prescribed fire courses. Fire is becoming a more used tool for rangeland professionals and wildlife professionals. But again, it's not nearly as established as the Southeast. So we're getting there. I hope to learn more as I continue to work here.
Great. Okay. Well, let's talk about your thesis work a little bit. So you're there working on your master's, kind of in this hybrid job / master's degree that you talked about. So part of the focus there is on indigo snakes. So what are you studying? What are you trying to learn about Texas indigo snakes for your master's?
So we're really focusing in on, the impacts of anthropogenic, disturbances in that region, in the lower Rio Grande Valley. Historically just an understudied region in terms of, ecosystems, animals, and processes. So it's also one of the fastest growing regions in the state. It used to be kind of just agriculture has a deep history there. The Rio Grande, it's called the Rio Grande Valley. It's really more of a delta, but those rich delta soils make it's just a hotspot for agriculture. So, that supports the economy for most of the year. But unfortunately, there's also been a lot of population expansion around the city hubs like Brownsville, McAllen, and right now between those two, they're kind of just filling in the gaps, and it's becoming this solid, just, urban interface. And, in addition, there is border barrier construction going on down there. So what I'm trying to do so I'm doing Texas Indigo Snakes, Texas Tortoises, and Texas Horned Lizards, is we have a little bit of limitations, not doing telemetry and mark recapture, but I am, building these species distribution models for each of the species. And, just a quick, try to cliff notes this species distribution model. You take species occurrences and appropriate environmental layers. I use raster layers that pertain to the species ecology. You kind of, it's just basically it looks at the landscape, and given the information you give it, occurrences and the environmental factors, it kind of calculates a probability of that species being present where that stack of environmental occurrences is across the landscape. So from that point, I was going to do some connectivity analyses, kind of looking at, I want to do a resistance layer, which basically is just the features on a landscape that might hinder or, help movement and dispersal. And just seeing how the anthropogenic disturbance going on, and, that's the urbanization, major highways, and border barrier, how that interrupts those linkages. So that's what I'm doing for all three. I'm having to tweak it a little bit for each thing. When you're building these models, like anyone who knows how to run R can do it, but it really helps to have, intimate species knowledge and knowledge of the ecological processes in the region to kind of be able to produce a good model. So I did just get finished with the Texas Indigo snake model. Still making a little bit of tweaks to it, but I'll be moving on to my connectivity analysis now, thankfully.
Yeah, if I had to predict, and you could correct me, or I'd like to hear your predictions, I guess, and maybe your work will correct me. But if I had to predict of those three species, I would, based on the little bit I know about all their ecology, I would have to guess that actually the Texas Indigo snake would do the best in a kind of mixed agriculture, semi-urban type landscape. I may be wrong on that, but I would assume the tortoise population.
I believe you are correct on that.
So
yeah, no, that's definitely, kind of my preliminary ideas from what I know. Like, I've got a literature hoard that's just insane, but I've just really dived into, to the ecology of these species. Definitely, the indigos, I mean, again, they're the most common snake down there. My first day surveying, we got like 4, which is something out of my dreams. Growing up obsessed with Eastern Indigo Snakes, I've just had dreams about catching fistfuls of indigos, and that's kind of my reality down in South Texas. It's really, you talked about like having to struggle with school and really wanting it. My struggle in school has made me so just, I don't take what I'm doing for granted a single day that goes by. I love my work, and getting to find indigos all the time is awesome. But definitely, the permeability of barriers on the landscape is a factor. And there are sections of the border barrier that are concrete wall. And I anticipate, and onto the other side of that concrete wall is a dense urban area. So I do anticipate seeing some pretty big interruptions to connectivity for these snakes, where the barrier is impermeable and where there's dense urban activity. The Texas tortoises, adults cannot move through even the permeable barriers. There are some wildlife crossings towards the Gulf. I believe they're put in mostly for ocelots, but they're pretty small, about the size of a piece of paper. But we have game cameras on them. We have yet to get a tortoise on it. But indigos actually will use the base of these fences to kind of hunt. We never see them using wildlife crossings. They're weaving through the fence, through the grass, probably looking for something to eat,
Yeah. Huh.
And with the horned lizard, there are a lot of invasive grasses, and fire ants are a huge problem. So, they use roads to bask, so it's not like additional road construction is a huge thing. But the spread of these invasive grasses that are turf grass style, so not bunch grasses, this is anecdotal, but we're seeing other phrynosoma across the country, just little subpopulations blanking out where these dense grasses have taken over. Because if you think about them evading predators, they hit this wall of grass and they cannot fit through there. They're kind of flat, So they cannot squeeze through tight spaces. So these invasive grasses are really taking over down there. And then fire ants, they have systems to work through harvester ant venom, but not fire ants. So I think it's definitely going to be more of a management concern for the horned lizards, but connectivity for the tortoise and the snake are going to be, I think we're going to see. I'm excited to see my results. I'm not there yet, but just based on my predictions.
I'm excited to see them as well. So you've had, it sounds like, incredible kind of career experiences, different things you've done, different geographies, great kind of life experiences, having to, really work hard and do other things to get where you are today. So what, but you're still relatively, young in your career. You're doing your master's, you're over a year into that. I told you I did the 5-year undergrad plan. I did the 3-year master's plan, and I think the 6-year PhD plan. So anyways, whenever you finish this master's, what does the future hold for you? Where do you want to go in your career? What do you want to be doing someday?
So, thankfully, since this is I'm hired as a research assistant, it's not like when my master's ends, I'm done. I have been fortunate. I love, NRI and the lab, the working group that I'm in, because we work very closely with the state herpetologist, and we do a lot of applied conservation research. I knew a long time ago, I didn't want to go into academia because it can be pretty ruthless. And I definitely thrive in, applied settings and in the field, but and I'm getting better at writing and doing the research. It's just there's a 7-year gap from undergrad to starting in my master's. So there's just been a little bit of an adjustment for me. This is a novel environment, but I think, I just talked about this with my supervisor today. I plan to stay on with NRI and just, kind of help. They're expanding out because it's a fairly new lab. There is a herpetology lab through Texas A&M proper that's been long established, focusing on dune sagebrush lizard work. But we work, again, more in the applied research department with NRI. So we've got a lot of really good projects to work on throughout the state. Chicken turtles, Houston toads, Louisiana pine snake work starting up here in Texas soon. Last one was seen in 2012. So we're just kind of surveying and, we're working in conjunction with the Louisiana Pine Snake Project, but there's a lot of cool stuff for me to do. So I at least want to continue working in this lab because, having to do a master's, this really put into perspective how short 2 years is. All the stuff that I have to get done. I kind of talked about the modeling and the connectivity analysis, and then there's writing on top of that. So I have a lot to do in 2 years. It'd be really nice to work in a less a pressurized environment with research. And honestly, I kind of work a little bit better with a little bit of a panini pressing me down to get me to work. But yeah, that's right now staying with NRI, but ultimately doing field research is my passion, and habitat management. There are talks of us expanding out maybe some of our fire capacity within my agency, and I want to try to be a part of that. But fire is not a full-time job if you don't live in California, as far as I know. So I still want to maintain those sides of my career because I am cat feeder. I am an excellent wildland firefighter. And I'd like to continue to marry those two concepts together because it brings a lot of value when it comes to management and understanding how fire moves through an ecosystem, how it impacts different animals, plants, etc., how the timing of fire can be used. With flatwood salamanders, the woody encroachment of ephemeral wetlands was largely from dormant season burning, which is when the ponds are full. And, that really helped me, that really expanded out my understanding of fire ecology. But yeah, so kind of maintaining my herp research, but also expanding out more into fire research is something I'd really like to do. And thankfully, NRI is, pretty good and forward thinking about that kind of stuff. So maybe I'll do a PhD. I don't want to think about it yet, but.
Okay, well, imagine that I come down to visit, and we've just finished a hard day in the field in South Florida, and we're sitting around a campfire, maybe having a cold beverage or two, and I turn to you and ask you to tell me your best snake story.
Oh man. So I've been thinking about this because I have a few, but this one stands out the most, even almost 10 years on. So I love Petabophus also, bull snakes, pine snakes, gopher snakes. And especially in Florida pine snakes are kind of one of those holy grail snakes. And so, I said when I was at UCF, I'd go to Ocala a lot, but I also would go to the Lake Wells Ridge to go road cruising with one of my buddies. We were always looking for pine snakes, and our success rate was not very high, but it's on those kind of clay sandy roads you kind of learn how to read snake patterns, kind of which way they're headed kind of thing. And on this particular day, we had come up this hill, a truck had just gone by us, and we see a fresh pine snake track over their tire tracks. We split up, and I'll never forget this. It is like ingrained in my memory. Probably, again, top favorite snake memory. I see this Florida pine snake periscoping under an orange tree because it's kind of in an old orange grove, and it didn't take off. I just got a second to kind of, it was the most Floridian, herp. It was just awesome. It was so cool. I mean, whenever I got it, we were just jumping and laughing and screaming. I mean, somebody would have thought the bomb went off. The snake was confused, but yeah, that is still to this day probably my favorite snake memory. My first Florida pine under an orange tree.
That's cool. That's some next level field herping. You guys literally tracked this thing and went into the forest to find it.
I haven't replicated
it. Great. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for coming on the podcast today and talking with us about Texas Indigo snakes.
Thanks.
Great. And I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.